Shadows over Europe, as the 17th century drew toward its darkest hour. Europe stood trembling beneath the shadow of an approaching storm. The Ottoman Empire, once a distant echo of conquest, was again on the march, and its eyes were fixed upon the heart of Christendom. Vienna, the glittering capital of the Habsburgs. The crossroads between East and West, where trade culture and power converged like rivers meeting the sea. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories from history. The winds of destiny stirred in the East where the great Sultan Mehmed IV reigned, young, ambitious, and eager to restore the might of his ancestors, yet behind his throne stood another power. The Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man of towering pride and unshakable confidence, he believed the Ottoman Empire was chosen by fate to bring Europe to its knees. His plan was not merely a campaign, but a vision, a grand design to claim Vienna and with it, the soul of the continent. In the courts of Europe, fear spread like wildfire. The Habsburg Emperor Leopold I knew that the Ottoman forces were gathering, yet his empire was divided, weakened by years of internal struggle. The nobility quarreled. Alliances fractured and whispers of betrayal filled the air. Only a few far-sighted men understood the scale of what was coming. Vienna was not just another city, it was the shield of Europe. Far from the marble halls of Vienna, in the quiet towns of Poland and the vast plains of Hungary, rumors of the Ottoman advance traveled with merchants, priests, and soldiers. Every tavern echoed with tales of Kara Mustafa's golden tents, and endless armies. Children were told to behave lest the Turks come for them. In their sleep, the image of the crescent rising over the horizon haunted Europe's collective mind, yet amidst fear, there was also defiance, faith, and a strange sense that something monumental was approaching. In the early months of 1683, the call to arms began. Banners were raised and messages were sent across kingdoms, but not all answered politics. Clouded unity, and some princes saw opportunity where others saw doom. In Vienna itself, preparations were hurried. Walls, reinforced food stored, and prayers whispered in every church, for the people knew that if the city fell, all of Europe would tremble. Meanwhile, Kara Mustafa's army gathered near Adrianople, a vast ocean of men, cannons, and horses stretching beyond sight from Anatolia to the Balkans. From the deserts of Arabia to the forests of Serbia, soldiers answered the Sultan's call. Banners of green and red fluttered against the morning sun. Muezzins called for victory, and drums thundered like the heartbeat of an empire awakening from slumber. Their confidence was absolute, for never before had such a force marched toward Europe's center. By the spring of that fateful year, the armies began their westward march. Cities and towns fell one by one as the Ottoman tide advanced, and Europe watched helplessly. Some prayed, others plotted, and a few, like the Polish King John III, Sobieski, began to prepare for the moment when all would hang in the balance. The fate of nations was being written, and soon the ground beneath Vienna would shake with the footsteps of history. As the spring sun climbed higher over the plains of Hungary, the Ottoman army rolled forward like a living tide, a sea of steel, silk, and banners shimmering beneath the horizon. Kara Mustafa Pasha rode at its head, his green standard of command trailing behind him. Each step of his horse echoed with purpose, for he believed this campaign would carve his name beside the greatest conquerors of his empire. The road to Vienna was not just a march, it was destiny unfolding with every drumbeat. Behind the scenes, letters flew across Europe, messages written in fear, desperation, and pride. Emperor Leopold I, aware of Vienna's vulnerability, sent frantic appeals to the Holy Roman Empire and to the Polish Commonwealth. He begged for unity against the advancing Ottoman host. But kings and princes hesitated, each wary of losing soldiers or power. Some even hoped the storm might pass them by, not realizing that when Vienna fell, none would be safe from the flames to follow. As the Ottoman legions pressed westward, Towns like Jiger and Komarum were crushed beneath their advance. Villages burned, fortresses surrendered, or were wiped from the map. Yet, Kara Mustafa commanded discipline. His was not a war of chaos, but of strategy. He wanted Vienna intact to be taken as a jewel, not destroyed, but claimed. He envisioned himself entering the city through its golden gates, not over its ashes. That pride would later haunt him more than any cannon or sword. In Vienna, the tension was unbearable. Emperor Leopold, after much hesitation, fled the capital for Linz. Leaving Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg to defend the city, the Count, though wounded and weary, took command with fierce determination. He knew the city's walls were old and its garrison too small, but he vowed to hold. Vienna will not kneel, he declared to his men as bells tolled across the city, calling citizens to prepare for what could be their last stand. Meanwhile, in Krakow, far to the north, King John III, Sobieski, read the emperor's plea. A seasoned commander, warrior, and devout man, he understood the weight of history pressing upon him. If Vienna fell, Poland would be next. Europe would crumble. He turned to his soldiers and said, "We march not for one city, but for all Christendom." The decision was made. The Polish Hussars, Europe's last cavalry of thunder, would ride again. As the summer deepened, the Ottoman army reached the outskirts of Vienna, its vanguard spreading across the Danube plains. Black tents and gleaming spears filled the landscape. The sound of marching boots and hammering tools thundered like distant storms. They built bridges, camps, and trenches in silence and precision. From dawn till dusk, the ground trembled with their arrival. The crescent banner now waved within sight of Vienna's spires. Inside the city, panic and courage wrestled within every heart. Priests led processions through narrow streets, praying for divine mercy while soldiers patrolled the walls, their armor catching the dying light. Mothers clutched their children as the distant sound of Ottoman drums rolled closer each night. The people of Vienna waited sleepless, knowing that soon the world would change forever. Far above the plains, smoke from campfires rose like a shroud into the evening sky. The Ottoman army, 200,000 strong, stretched as far as the eye could see. The fate of empires was now measured in days, and on the horizon, the city of Vienna glowed faintly in the dusk, unaware that by the next sunrise it would stand at the edge of eternity. The summer of 1683 burned hotter than any in memory, and with it came the fire of war. The Ottoman army, vast and relentless, encircled Vienna like a tightening noose. 200,000 men, janissaries, Sobieski engineers, and artillerymen filled the plains and hills beyond the city walls. Their camps stretched from the Danube to the Vienna woods, black tents like shadows of an empire determined to reshape the world at their center. Beneath the great green pavilion stood Kara Mustafa Pasha, gazing toward the city with eyes that saw not stone and mortar, but glory and immortality. Within Vienna, Count Starhemberg commanded barely 15,000 defenders, a mix of soldiers, city guards, and citizens too proud to flee. They faced starvation, sickness, and exhaustion. But they stood behind their crumbling walls with unyielding hearts. For them, this was not just a city. It was home, and surrender was not an option. Cannons from the Ottoman lines opened fire at dawn. The sound was like thunder splitting the heavens, shaking rooftops and hearts alike. Dust and smoke rose into the air as entire sections of the outer wall crumbled under the relentless bombardment. Yet still the defenders held. Days turned into weeks, and the siege became a slow, grinding test of endurance. The Ottomans dug trenches and tunnels, moving closer each day, their engineers working by torchlight to undermine the city's defenses. At night, the Viennese could hear the muffled hammering below their feet, a chilling reminder that the enemy was not only outside the walls, but beneath them. When one of these tunnels finally collapsed, killing dozens of sappers, the defenders cheered from the ramparts, small victories that meant survival for another day. Food and water began to dwindle. Horses were slaughtered. bread was baked with sawdust. Yet the people refused to yield. Priests moved through the streets, blessing the wounded and whispering courage into trembling souls. Count Starhemberg himself, often covered in dust and blood, appeared on the battlements daily. His presence alone ignited hope. "Vienna does not surrender," he said again and again. Even as cannonballs shattered towers above his head, his voice carried over the chaos like a vow to history itself. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman camp, Kara Mustafa grew restless. His plan had been to break Vienna quickly, to seize the city intact as the crown of his victories. But the defenders refused to collapse, and his frustration began to crack the calm facade. War reports arrived that European forces were uniting, that John Sobieski's army was on the move, but the Grand Vizier dismissed them, confident that by the time help arrived, Vienna would already be his. Still, the drums of the besiegers grew louder, faster, echoing across the fields like a warning that the moment of reckoning approached. By August, the city was near ruin. Entire districts had been reduced to rubble. The air was thick with smoke, and the Danube ran dark beneath the weight of war. Still, Vienna endured. Women carried water to the walls. Children gathered spent musket balls, and old men repaired barricades with trembling hands. Every soul within the city had become part of its defense, united by desperation and faith. They prayed for deliverance, though many had begun to doubt it would ever come. Then, on a night heavy with mist and silence, the Ottoman engineers set off their largest explosion yet. The ground shook violently. A massive section of the wall collapsed, and through the breach surged waves of Janissaries. Their battle cries filled the air. Torches flickered like fireflies as steel met steel. The defenders fought hand-to-hand, blades clashing in the smoke, and dusty air trembled with their struggle after hours of chaos. The attack was repelled, but at a terrible cost: bodies and broken weapons littered the breach, and the defenders realized that the next assault might be their last. Yet somewhere beyond the mountains banners were rising, white and red, the crest of Poland gleaming in the dawn. King John III. Sobieski's army was nearing, their horses crossing rivers, their armor glinting beneath the sun. They rode for Vienna, unaware of the horrors that awaited them, and within the besieged city, hope flickered once more like the faintest candle in a sea of darkness. The dawn that rose over the plains beyond Vienna on September 12, 1683, was no ordinary morning. It carried the scent of destiny, the hum of vengeance, and the whisper of deliverance for a city that had stood on the edge of annihilation. The first rays of sunlight cut through the mist, glinting upon tens of thousands of armored men waiting upon the slopes of the Kahlenberg Hill. And their banners, gold, crimson, white, rippled in the wind like living fire. This was the army of salvation, led by King John III, Sobieski of Poland, the man history would remember as the savior of Vienna. From the ramparts of the besieged city, exhausted soldiers and starving citizens watched the horizon with hollow eyes. And then, through the haze, they saw it, a sea of armor stretching to the edge of sight, sunlight flashing on steel helmets, horses stamping the ground, the cross gleaming on standards fluttering high. And the sound that followed the low, thunderous roll of hooves spread like a heartbeat across the valley. Those who heard it wept, for they knew that hope, long buried beneath ashes and smoke, had finally returned. Sobieski's forces were a coalition forged from desperation and faith. Poles, Austrians, Bavarians, Saxons, and soldiers from countless smaller states stood side by side. Men who spoke different tongues but prayed to the same God, united not by empire but by the will to survive. They were 50,000 against the Ottoman host of nearly twice their number. Yet none faltered, for they were led by a man whose courage inspired even the faint-hearted. Sobieski, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that burned with quiet purpose, rode among his men. His presence as commanding as a storm, his armor glinting like molten gold under the rising sun. Behind him stood the most feared cavalry in Europe, the Polish Winged Hussars, elite knights whose wings, adorned with eagle feathers, caught the light of dawn and shimmered like angels descending from heaven. Their reputation was legend. They had crushed armies larger than themselves, and now, as they waited upon the ridge, they knew they would ride again into the jaws of destiny. The Ottoman camp below bustled like an empire of shadows, tents stretching for miles, minarets rising among the smoke, drums echoing through the valley as Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, prepared for the final confrontation. Inside Vienna, Count Starhemberg, the Austrian commander, received word of Sobieski's arrival, his face hardened by months of siege and hunger. Softened for the first time, he climbed the broken walls, looked out, and saw the distant banners of the Polish king. He raised his sword to the sky and shouted, his voice breaking through the smoke. "Vienna shall not fall." The soldiers on the walls took up the cry, their cheers echoing through the ruins, giving life to a city that had almost forgotten how to hope. Kara Mustafa Pasha, from his lavish green pavilion in the center of his camp, watched the movement on the hills with cold precision. His army had bled but not broken. He believed victory still lay within his grasp. "Let them come," he told his officers, "and they shall drown in their own faith." He ordered his artillery to face the hills, the janissaries to hold the line, and his cavalry to prepare for a countercharge. But deep within, doubt had begun to stir. Not fear of men, but fear of fate. Night descended over the valley like a heavy cloak, and both armies lit their fires. 1,000 flames flickered across the darkened hills, the air thick with prayer, sweat, and steel. Sobieski walked among his men, speaking not as a king, but as a brother. "Tomorrow," he said, "we fight not for crowns, but for the light that still burns in every home, every heart, every church that stands free. We fight for the world that must not be swallowed by darkness." His words carried across the camp, and the men bowed their heads, whispering prayers into the cold night air. At dawn, the hills trembled with the roar of cannon fire. The battle had begun. The Allied artillery unleashed its fury upon the Ottoman lines, thunder rolling across the valley, smoke rising like a shroud over the plains. The janissaries answered with their own volleys, and soon the earth itself seemed to shake with the violence of two worlds colliding. Infantry from Bavaria and Saxony charged down the slopes, clashing with Ottoman spearmen in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Swords flashed, shields splintered, and cries of pain mixed with the roar of drums and the blare of horns. Still, neither side yielded. For hours the battle raged across the fields and forests. Men fought and fell among the trees. Cannonballs tore through ranks. Yet the Ottoman center held firm, and for a moment it seemed the Allies would break under the relentless counterattacks. Sobieski watched from the ridge, his eyes narrowing as he read the rhythm of the chaos below. Ow! And then, when the time was right, he raised his sword toward the sun and shouted the words that would echo through the centuries. "Now, for God and for Poland, charge!" The Winged Hussars surged forward, 20,000 horsemen descending like a living avalanche. The thunder of their hooves shook the very earth. Their wings screamed through the wind, and their lances, lowered in unison, glittered like lightning bolts about to strike. The Ottoman lines, weary, disordered, and shaken, could not withstand the impact. The Hussars smashed through them with unstoppable force, trampling resistance beneath a storm of steel. Their momentum carried them deep into the enemy camp, scattering cavalry, breaking formations, and sending waves of panic rippling through the Ottoman ranks. Kara Mustafa's pavilion fell as the Polish banners pierced through his defenses. The Grand Vizier watched in disbelief as his army, once so disciplined and vast, dissolved into chaos. Tents burned, men fled, and the great crescent standards toppled one by one. Sobieski himself rode into the heart of the storm, his sword raised high, his horse blazing through dust and smoke, until at last the battle was won. By sunset, Vienna stood free, the Ottoman siege shattered, and Europe, for a moment, was united in triumph. The morning after the thunder of battle was eerily still the fields beyond. Vienna lay cloaked in mist. The smell of gunpowder and ash lingered in the cold air. The once golden plains were now darkened by the weight of history, the echoes of thousands of men who had fought and fallen in silence. King John III Sobieski stood upon a ridge overlooking the valley, his armor dented and dusted with the scars of war. Yet his gaze was steady, proud, and unbroken. Beside him rode the commanders of the Allied forces. Duke Charles of Lorraine, the Elector of Bavaria, and generals whose names would soon be sung in churches and courts across Europe. Below them, the remnants of the Ottoman army fled in disarray, their banners torn, their cannons abandoned, their dream of conquest vanishing with the morning sun. Vienna, that wounded jewel of Europe, now breathed again. The city gates creaked open, and the people, pale and hollow-eyed, poured out to greet their saviors. Priests knelt in the dust and wept, soldiers embraced like brothers. And church bells, long silent, began to ring once more, their sound cutting through the smoke like a song of resurrection. Sobieski dismounted and entered the city on foot, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. As he passed the battered walls and shattered homes, he saw faces that had known only fear for months now light up with tears of relief. A child offered him a wilted flower, a simple gesture that carried the weight of all gratitude. Sobieski bent down, accepted it, and whispered softly, "For every tear shed in this city, a prayer has been answered." In the Ottoman camp, chaos reigned. Kara Mustafa Pasha had vanished during the night, abandoning his pavilion and the treasure of his army. What had once been a city of tents and banners was now a sea of ruin. Burned wagons, scattered weapons, and the echo of a defeat that would haunt an empire. The Grand Vizier's arrogance, his refusal to retreat when wisdom demanded it, had led to catastrophe, and the Sultan, upon hearing of this calamity, would soon send him the silken cord, the Ottoman mark of death. The empire that had stretched from the Danube to the deserts of Arabia now trembled on its edges. Its aura of invincibility shattered upon the walls of Vienna, as the Allied leaders gathered in the city's cathedral. The air was thick with the smoke of candles and the murmur of prayers. Sobieski knelt before the altar, removed his helmet, and offered a single line that history would remember forever. "Venemus vitimus Deus visit." We came. We saw God. Conquered. His words echoed against the vaulted stone and settled into the hearts of all who heard them outside. The citizens crowded the streets, waving flags, singing hymns, and lighting torches that turned the night into a festival of flame. Vienna was alive again, and with it all of Europe drew a breath of freedom. But even amid victory, the king's heart was heavy, for he knew that wars never truly end with battles. The price of peace is often written in the quiet suffering of those who survive. He walked through the makeshift camps of the wounded, speaking softly to soldiers who lay upon straw beds, their faces pale, their eyes distant. He offered them not royal words, but human ones: comfort, gratitude, and prayer. Many smiled through their pain, whispering blessings for their king. And though Sobieski's soul carried the burden of every life lost, he took solace in knowing that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The cross had stood firm, the city had endured, and the tide of conquest had been turned back. As the days passed, ambassadors and envoys arrived from every corner of Europe, bearing gifts, praise, and promises of alliance. In royal courts from Paris to Madrid, from Rome to London, the tale of Vienna spread like a sacred fire. Poets wrote of angels descending with wings of iron. Painters captured the charge of the hussars in strokes of gold and crimson. And the name Sobieski became a legend whispered in reverence. Yet the king, when asked about his triumph, merely said, "It was not my hand that won this day, but the will of heaven." For in his heart he knew, victory is never claimed, it is granted. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the Danube into a river of molten light, Sobieski rode out once more to the battlefield. The plains that had roared with fury now lay silent under the autumn sky. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying with it the echoes of drums and prayers. He dismounted, knelt upon the earth, and closed his eyes. He thought of the men who would never see their homes again, of the children who would grow up in peace because of them, and of the fragile, fleeting nature of all glory. The world would remember this victory, but for the king, the truest honor was not in triumph. It was in the light that now shone over a city once lost to darkness. As night fell, the first stars emerged, faint, trembling, eternal, and beneath them, Vienna slept. No longer a city under siege, but a symbol of endurance. The bells rang again, softer now, as if to cradle the dreams of the living and the memory of the brave, and somewhere, in the hush between the sounds, history itself whispered, this was the day Europe was reborn. The smoke of the battlefield had long faded, yet its shadow lingered across empires, across hearts, and across centuries. After the clash at Vienna, the balance of power in the world began to shift. The Ottoman banners that once thundered proudly across Europe were now retreating, their might dimmed, their ambition tempered by the weight of defeat. The once unstoppable march of the crescent had met the immovable strength of the cross. And though peace would come in time, it came with the silence of exhaustion rather than celebration. Kara Mustafa Pasha was brought before the Sultan in the silent halls of Adorn. The man who had once commanded an army of 200,000 now stood stripped of honor. His eyes hollow, his voice steady but broken. The Sultan said nothing as the silken cord was brought forth. It gleamed faintly in the candlelight. A symbol of disgrace for those who had failed the empire, Kara Mustafa bowed his head and whispered only, I sought the glory of Islam, but forgot the mercy of God. And with that, the story of his ambition ended. His fate sealed not by his enemies, but by his own pride. In Vienna, life began to bloom again. The city rebuilt its walls, its churches, its homes, and its faith markets reopened. Laughter returned to the streets, and every toll of the church bell became a hymn of survival. King John III Sobieski returned to Poland a hero, welcomed by roaring crowds and grateful hearts. Yet the man who had once led the greatest cavalry charge in history did not seek glory. He spent his later years in quiet devotion, writing letters of peace, visiting the wounded, and teaching his sons that the greatest victory is not in conquering lands, but in preserving them. The king's armor, still marked by the battle, was hung in Wall Cathedral, not as a relic of war, but as a testament to faith and courage. For Europe, the Battle of Vienna became more than just a triumph. It was a turning point, an awakening. The armies that once feared the Ottoman advance now found hope in unity. Nations that had long quarreled among themselves learned the value of standing together, and though new wars would follow in the years to come, none would ever carry the same weight, the same sense of destiny, the same echo of divine intervention. History would remember Vienna as the day when light broke through the longest night. In Istanbul, the Sultan stood upon his balcony, looking out over the Bosphorus as the sun sank behind the minarets. The call to prayer rose in the distance, soft and mournful, a reminder that empires rise and fall, not by the sword alone, but by the hearts of men. He turned to his viziers and said quietly, "The world changes, and so must we." His words were not of defeat, but of reflection. A rare moment of truth in the mind of a ruler. Perhaps, in that silence, even he understood the glory of conquest fades, but the wisdom of restraint endures. Years later, when the last survivors of Vienna were old and gray, they would tell their grandchildren of that day when the world stood at the edge of darkness and a single charge of horsemen, a thunderstorm of faith and steel, turned the tide of history. They spoke of Sobieski not as a king, but as a man who believed, who fought not for power, but for peace, and who reminded the world that courage, when guided by righteousness, can shape the destiny of nations. And so, the story of Vienna did not end with victory, but with silence, the silence of peace after a storm, the silence that follows prayer, the silence that allows the living to remember the fallen without tears. The Danube flowed quietly once more, carrying the whispers of history along its banks. past villages and cities that would rise again, under skies that would someday forget the sound of war drums, but never the echo of that one immortal cry, Deus vicit, God conquered.